Part 1, The Hollow Town. Welcome back to Tales of the Dark. There's a certain kind of quiet you only notice when you're completely alone in a place that isn't meant to feel empty. It's a heavy, pressurized silence. The kind where even your own breathing starts to sound out of place, too loud, too rhythmic, like you're a metronome in a room made of glass. It's the kind of silence where you begin to realize that if something did happen, if you screamed until your lungs gave out, nobody would hear you. Not because they aren't there, but because they've already learned to stop listening. This happened in late October, just before winter started settling in. The air had that bite to it, the kind that doesn't just make you shiver, it makes you feel like the world is dying around you. At the time, I was traveling for work. I did overnight maintenance on industrial refrigeration units. It's a niche job, mostly servicing small businesses in rural areas, towns that are too small to have their own technicians so they contract people from out of state. I was used to the lifestyle. I actually liked it for a while. Long, meditative drives through the heartland, cheap motels with neon signs that buzzed like dying insects, and quiet nights where I didn't have to talk to a soul. It was routine. It was safe until this one. The town I was sent to, let's call it Oakhaven, though I'm sure that's not its name, didn't feel right the moment I crossed the city limits. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and you can tell people were just arguing, that static in the air. This town had that, except it wasn't an argument, it was a funeral. It wasn't abandoned, but it felt like it was on its way there. It was decaying from the inside out. Half the buildings on the main strip were boarded up with plywood that had turned grey from years of rain. Streetlights flickered with a spasmodic, sickly yellow pulse instead of staying steady. And even though it was barely past sunset, maybe 6:30 p.m., there was almost no one outside. No kids on bikes, no couples walking, no movement, just empty roads stretching into a hungry darkness. Part 2, The check in my company had booked me into a motel on the outskirts. It was one of those places that looked like it had been frozen in 1978. It sat just off a 2-lane road, a thin ribbon of asphalt that felt like it led to nowhere. On 3 sides, the motel was choked by dense skeletal trees. On the 4th, an empty field of tall, dead grass that hissed when the wind caught it. The building was a single-story L shape. The parking lot was a disaster of cracked concrete and weeds. There were maybe 6 cars total. In a place with 30 rooms, that's a bad sign. It means the only people staying there are people who have nowhere else to go. I remember sitting in my truck for a long time before I even turned off the engine. I just stared at the flickering vacancy sign. Every instinct in my gut was telling me to put the truck in reverse and drive until I hit a Marriott, but I was tired. My back ached and I had a 4 a.m. start the next morning. I brushed the dread off as travel fatigue, a trick of the mind. Inside the office, the air hit me like a physical weight. It smelled stale, old cigarettes, damp carpet, and that metallic scent of a space that hasn't seen a breeze in a decade. The woman behind the counter didn't look up when I walked in. She was staring at a bank of grainy security monitors. When she finally did notice me, she gave a polite smile, but it was a mask. Her eyes were darting, restless. She checked me in without a word of small talk. No, where are you from? Or working hard. She just kept glancing past my shoulder out toward the dark parking lot, like she was counting the shadows. When she handed me the heavy brass key, her hand brushed mine. She was cold, ice cold. She paused for a beat, her grip tightening on the key just enough so I couldn't pull it away yet. "Keep your door locked tonight," she said. Her voice was a dry rasp. I gave a small, nervous laugh. I always do, habit of the job. She didn't laugh back, her expression went stone cold. "I mean it, lock the deadbolt, use the chain, and if someone knocks, don't answer it. Not for a towel, not for a light, not for anything. Unless you know exactly who it is, you keep that door shut." I felt the hair on my neck stand up. I asked if there had been trouble, thefts, break-ins, that sort of thing. She just shook her head quickly, looking back at the monitors. "Just people passing through. We get a lot of drifters, people who don't want to be found." Then she added something that chilled me more than the cold air outside. "And if you hear anything outside your door, call the office. Don't go out to check, just call us." The way she said it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't like a line from a movie. It was casual, exhausted, like she was tired of giving the same warning to people who never listened. Part 3, The man in the truck. I stepped back out into the night. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees. I started walking toward my room 114 at the far end of the L. That's when I noticed the truck. It was parked 2 spaces down from mine. It was an old, heavy-duty model, dark navy or black, I couldn't tell. The engine was idling, a low guttural rumble that vibrated in my chest, but there were no headlights, just the interior dash lights giving off a faint, ghostly green glow. At first I figured it was someone just getting ready to leave. But as I got closer, I realized the driver wasn't doing anything. He wasn't checking a map. He wasn't on a phone. He wasn't even shifting in his seat. He was just sitting there, both hands gripped at the 10-2 position on the steering wheel, facing straight forward. Staring into the dark woods at the edge of the lot, I slowed down. My heart started a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I tried to see his face as I passed the driver's side window, but the glass was tinted or just too dirty. All I could see was a silhouette, a large, unmoving shape. I could feel his eyes on me. Even though he wasn't turning his head, I knew he was aware of every step I took. It was that predator feeling, the one your DNA remembers from when humans were still hunted by things in the tall grass. I didn't look back. I practically ran the last 5 feet to my door, jammed the key in and stepped inside. I slammed the door and threw every lock I had. Part 4, the first watch. The room was a relic. Worn orange carpet, a sagging queen bed and a TV that looked like it weighed 100 pounds. I turned the TV on immediately. I needed the sound. I needed to hear a human voice, even if it was just a rerun of a sitcom. I tried to settle in. I had picked up a lukewarm burger from a gas station on the way in. I ate it sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the door. I kept thinking about the woman's warning, don't go out. By 10:30, the exhaustion finally started to win. I climbed under the covers, leaving the bathroom light on so the room wasn't pitch black. I was just starting to drift into that heavy, dreamless sleep when the first sound broke through. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was faint, like a branch hitting the window, but there were no branches near my window. Then came the footsteps. They weren't the hurried steps of someone going to their room. They were slow, heavy, deliberate. They started at the beginning of the walkway and moved toward my end of the building. Thump, pause, thump, pause. They stopped right outside my door. I froze. I stopped breathing. I stared at the gap under the door. I saw the shadow of 2 boots break the light from the parking lot. They just stood there, no knocking, no talking, just existing on the other side of that thin piece of wood. My mind raced. Was it the guy from the truck, the woman from the desk? I waited for a key to turn. I waited for the door to rattle. But after a full minute of agonizing silence, the footsteps started again. They moved further down toward the end of the building where the woods began. I let out a shaky breath. Just a guest, I whispered to myself. Just a guy looking for his room. But then, less than 60 seconds later, I heard them again, coming back, same pace. Thump, pause, thump, and again they stopped at my door. This time they stayed longer. I could hear something else now, a wet, heavy sound, breathing. Someone was standing inches from my door, breathing through their nose in long, ragged draws. I sat up, gripping the sheets. I wanted to yell, "Who's there?" but the words died in my throat. I was terrified that if I spoke, I'd be acknowledging them. I'd be inviting a response I wasn't ready for. Finally, the shadow moved. The footsteps receded. I couldn't handle the unknown anymore. I crept out of bed, my bare feet silent on the carpet. I reached the door and pressed my eye to the peephole. The parking lot was a sea of grey and black. My truck was there. The dark truck was still there, engine still idling, its exhaust a white plume in the cold air. But the walkway, empty. There was nobody there. No one was walking away. No one was hiding in the shadows of the pillars. The walkway was a straight line. There was nowhere to go that quickly. My stomach dropped. How could I hear footsteps and see a shadow but see nothing through the lens? Part 5. The gap. I went back to bed, but sleep was an impossibility now. I was hyper-aware of every sound, the hum of the fridge, the settling of the floorboards. Around 11:15 it happened. Knock, knock, 2 taps, soft, polite, almost like a friend coming over for a late-night chat. I didn't move. Knock, knock, the same pattern, the same volume. I walked back to the door. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I looked through the peephole again. Again, nothing. The lot was empty. The dark truck sat unmoved. That's when I noticed the curtain. The heavy floral curtains were supposed to be closed tight. But when I looked at the edge where they met the wall, I saw a sliver of the night sky. The curtain had been moved, but it hadn't just fallen. As I watched, a pale, thin finger reached into the gap from the outside. It hooked the fabric and slowly, silently pulled it back an inch further. My heart didn't just beat, it slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. Someone was standing flush against the wall of the building, outside the field of vision of the peephole, and they were peering into my room through the side of the window. I didn't think. I grabbed the curtain and yanked it shut with a violent force, screaming, "Get the hell away from my room!" Silence followed, no running footsteps, no shouting, just the wind. I retreated to the center of the room. I grabbed my heavy work flashlight, the big maglite that doubles as a club. I stood there in the dark, my eyes fixed on that curtain, and then I heard it. The sound that broke me, screey, a faint metallic scraping. It was coming from the door handle. Someone was out there with a tool. They weren't trying to kick the door down, they were trying to be surgical. They were picking the lock. I saw the deadbolt thumb turn move, just a fraction of a millimeter. Left, right, left. They were testing the tension. I didn't call the office. I realized then that the woman at the desk, she wasn't worried about me, she was a witness. She knew what happened in room 114. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. "I'm at the Pine Crest Motel," I hissed into the phone. "Someone is trying to break into my room. Room 114, please, God, hurry." The dispatcher started asking questions, but I dropped the phone. The door handle turned. The door creaked against the security chain. A face appeared in the crack. It wasn't a mask, it was a man. He looked ordinary, maybe in his 40s, wearing a tan work jacket. But his eyes, they were wide, bloodshot, and completely devoid of any human emotion. He didn't look angry, he looked hungry. He didn't say a word, he just pushed against the chain. The wood of the door frame began to splinter. Crack, crack, I didn't wait. I charged the door, swinging the maglite with every ounce of terror-fueled strength I had. I smashed it down onto the hand that was gripping the edge of the door. I heard the wet snap of bone. The man didn't scream, he didn't even groan, he just slowly withdrew his hand. I slammed the door shut and shoved the heavy dresser in front of it. I retreated to the bathroom, locked that door too, and climbed into the bathtub with my light, waiting for the police. Part 6, The Aftermath. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, they found the door to my room standing open. The dresser had been pushed aside like it was made of balsa wood. But I was still in the bathroom, safe. The man was gone. The dark truck was gone. The police took my statement, but they didn't seem surprised. They told me they'd been called to this motel 3 times in the last month for prowlers. They never caught anyone. When I went to the front office to demand a refund and leave, the woman wasn't there. There was a man behind the desk I hadn't seen before. He looked at my bruised knuckles and the fear in my eyes and just handed me a receipt. "You're lucky," he said, not looking up. "Lucky," I spat. "Someone tried to kill me." "No," he replied, finally looking at me. His eyes were hollow. "He didn't want to kill you. If he wanted to kill you, he would have used the back window. He wanted you to come outside. He wanted to see how long you'd play the game." I drove 6 hours that night without stopping. I quit that job a week later. I still do maintenance, but I don't do overnights. And I never ever stay in a motel where the trees touch the building, because sometimes the quiet isn't just silence. Sometimes the quiet is something holding its breath, waiting for you to turn your back. Stay safe out there. And remember, if you hear a knock tonight, don't answer it. Part 7, the morning after picking up from the room, I woke up late. For a few golden seconds, the sunlight bleeding through the floral curtains convinced me I was safe. The terrors of the night, the scratching, the splintering wood, the pale face in the gap, felt like the jagged remnants of a fever dream. I told myself I had overreacted. Maybe the prowler was just a local drunk, and the woman at the desk was just a cynical veteran of a rough town. That comfort lasted exactly 10 seconds. I stood up to pull the curtains, expecting to see a bustling morning parking lot. Instead, my heart did a sickening drop into my stomach. The truck was back. It was parked in the exact same spot, 2 spaces down from my unit. Same dark, indeterminate color, same idling rumble that I could feel through the soles of my feet. It was positioned at an angle that defied logic. It wasn't parked for convenience, it was parked for a tactical view of my front door. I stood there, paralyzed. I hadn't heard it pull in. My truck was parked right next to it, and yet not a single gravel crunch had woken me. It was as if the vehicle had simply materialized out of the morning mist. Then the driver's side door creaked open. The man who stepped out was tall, lanky in a way that felt unnatural, like his limbs were just a bit too long for his torso. He wore a dark, heavy canvas jacket and a baseball cap pulled so low it cast his entire upper face into a void of shadow. He didn't stretch, he didn't check his watch. He just stood by the open door completely still like a statue carved from charcoal. Then slowly, excruciatingly slowly, he turned his head toward my window. Logically, he couldn't see me. I was behind a thick curtain with only a half-inch gap. But the air in the room suddenly felt freezing. It wasn't a glance, it was a lock. He was staring directly into my eyes through the fabric. He stood like that for a full minute, a silent sentinel in the dead light of morning. Then, without a word or a change in expression, he climbed back in and drove away. He didn't peel out, he didn't rush. He drifted out of the lot like a ghost leaving a graveyard. Part 8, the local warning I didn't linger. I threw my boots on, grabbed my tool bag, and practically bolted to my truck. I spent the entire drive to the supermarket job site checking my rearview mirror until my neck ached. Every dark vehicle that appeared behind me sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system that made my hands shake on the wheel. But the truck never showed. Work was supposed to be my sanctuary. I spent the morning elbow deep in the wiring of a massive walk-in freezer. The hum of the machinery and the mundane complaints of the store manager were supposed to ground me. But every time the automatic doors hissed open at the front of the store, I found myself snapping my head up, looking for a tan jacket and a low-slung cap. Around lunchtime, I flagged down one of the floor stalkers, a kid named Elias who looked like he'd lived in this town his whole life. "Hey," I started, trying to sound casual. "Is there any other place to stay around here? The Pine Crest is a bit rustic for me." Elias stopped mid-motion, a crate of canned corn hovering in the air. He gave me a look that wasn't just weird, it was pitying. "Why are you staying at the Pine Crest?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave. "Company booked it," I said, wiping grease onto a rag. "Why? What's the word on it?" Elias looked around to make sure the manager wasn't watching, then stepped closer. "Look, man, I wouldn't stay there another night if I were you. People in town, we don't go near that stretch of the road after dark." "Why not? Break-ins?" He shook his head, his face darkening. "It's not just crime, it's disappearances. Every few years, a traveler goes in and just doesn't come out the other side. The cops find their cars left in the lot, keys still in the ignition, luggage still on the bed. But the people? Gone. The owner, that woman at the desk, she's been there through all of it. People say she's not the one doing it, but she's the one who clears the table when the meal is over." My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. "The guy in the truck," I whispered. "A dark pickup, you know him." Elias turned back to his shelves, his shoulders tensed. "I've said too much already, just find a rest stop, sleep in your truck at a gas station, anywhere but there." Part 9, the return. By the time my shift ended at 6:00 p.m., the sun was a bruised purple smudge on the horizon. I had made a plan. I was going back, grabbing my suitcase and hitting the interstate. I didn't care about the money I'd lose on the booking. I didn't care if I had to drive until 3:00 a.m. to find a Motel 6. But as I pulled into the Pine Crest parking lot, my headlights swept over the L-shaped building and stopped. The green pickup was there. It was idling in the same spot, its exhaust mingling with the evening fog. It felt like an ambush. I sat in my truck, the engine still running, staring at that dark silhouette in the driver's seat. He was waiting. He knew I had to come back for my things. I debated just leaving the luggage. It was just clothes and a cheap laptop, but my passport was in that bag. My spare truck keys were in that bag. I gripped my maglite, stepped out of the truck, and made a move for room 114. I didn't look at the pickup. I kept my eyes on my door. I heard his door open, the heavy thud of boots hitting the gravel. I scrambled inside my room, locked the deadbolt, and leaned my back against the door, gasping for air. Part 10, the siege of room 114. I didn't turn on the lights. I threw my things into my suitcase with frantic, clumsy hands. I was halfway through packing when I heard it. Clink, the sound of metal hitting the floor. I looked at the door. Someone had slid something under it. I crawled over and picked it up. It was a Polaroid photo, grainy, dark. It was a picture of me, not from 5 minutes ago. It was a picture of me sleeping in the bed from the night before. Taken from the perspective of the bedside table, he had been inside. The woman at the desk hadn't just watched, she had given him a key. "We are full," she had said. They weren't full of guests, they were full of traps. Then came the voice. It wasn't a scream or a growl. It was a calm, melodic whistle coming from right outside the wood of the door. A nursery rhyme. London Bridge is falling down. I grabbed the heavy dresser and began to shove it toward the door again, but this time the door didn't just rattle. It exploded. A heavy sledgehammer swung through the center panel, showering me in splinters. A second swing took out the hinges. The man wasn't picking the lock anymore. The game the desk clerk mentioned, it was over. I didn't go for the door. I remembered what the clerk said. If he wanted to kill you, he would have used the back window. He expected me to stay and fight the door, so I did the opposite. I grabbed my bag, wrapped my jacket around my arm, and dived through the bathroom window, shattering the glass and tumbling into the dead, frozen grass of the woods behind the motel. Part 11. The woods and the highway. I ran. I didn't look back. I could hear the crashing behind me, the sound of him clearing the dresser, the sound of the bathroom door being kicked in. The woods were a nightmare of thorns and low-hanging branches. I could hear him behind me, but he wasn't running. He was walking, that same slow, measured pace. Thump, pause, thump. He knew the terrain. He knew exactly where the property ended and the swamp began. I saw the glow of a nearby gas station through the trees, the one where I'd bought the burger. I burst through the tree line, covered in scratches and bleeding from the glass, and collapsed into the store. The clerk there, a different man, didn't even ask questions. He saw my face and picked up the phone. "He's at it again," the clerk said into the receiver. "Room 114. By the time the police got there, the pine crest was dark. The vacancy sign was off. The woman at the desk was gone. The man in the truck was gone. And most terrifyingly, when the police entered room 114, they didn't find my luggage or the splintered door. The room was pristine. The door was brand new. The dresser was in its place. It was as if the struggle had never happened, as if I had never been there at all. Part 12. Conclusion. I never went back to that part of the country. I took a job in a warehouse, stationary, boring and brightly lit. But sometimes when I'm driving home late at night and I see a dark pickup truck idling on the side of the road with its lights off, I don't look. I don't slow down. I just keep driving. Because I know what's waiting in the quiet places. I know that some motels don't want your money. They want your presence. They want you to become part of the history of the room. Stay in the light, everyone. And if a stranger tells you to keep your door locked, don't just lock it. Leave. Part 13. The illusion of choice. I didn't pull into my spot. I couldn't. I sat there at the mouth of the motel lot, the entrance framed by two rotting wooden posts that looked like jagged teeth against the night sky. My engine was humming, a steady, comforting vibration that felt like the only tether I had left to the real world. I stared at that truck. I stared at it with a desperate intensity, praying that if I blinked, if I waited just 60 more seconds, it would vanish. I wanted it to be a trick of the light, a lingering ghost of my own exhaustion. But it didn't budge. It sat there, low, quiet, and fundamentally wrong. It looked heavier than a normal truck, a dark mass that seemed to pull the light out of the air around it. The engine was definitely on this time. I could see the rhythmic, ghostly shimmer of heat rising from the hood, distorting the view of the dead trees behind it. No headlights, no interior glow, just a void behind the windshield where a human being should be, waiting for me. I felt a physical pressure building in my chest, a crushing weight that made every breath feel like I was inhaling silt. Every instinct, every primal fight or flight response coded into my DNA was screaming at me to floor the gas. To spin the wheel, scream out of that lot and never look back. I didn't need the tools, I didn't need the clothes. I could buy a new life for the cost of a few $1,000s, and it would be a bargain compared to whatever was sitting in that truck. But my life was in that room. My laptop with years of work, my specialized diagnostic tools that cost more than my truck, and my sense of dignity. More importantly, a cold, rational thought pierced through the panic. If I leave now, I'm just a moving target. On these two-lane rural roads with no streetlights and no witnesses, that truck would be on my bumper in seconds. And out there in the blackness between towns, there are no motel offices to run into. So I did something I'm not proud of. I gave in. I drove in. Slow crawling, I tried to make my movements look bored, like I was a tired worker who hadn't noticed a thing. I was acting for an audience of one. I parked under the brightest security light. a buzzing sodium lamp that cast a sickly, bruised orange glow over the asphalt. I kept my engine running for a long heartbeat, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. The truck didn't move, it didn't flash its lights, it didn't rev its engine, it just watched. It was the silence of a spider watching a fly land on the very outer edge of its web. Part 14. The Walk of Dread. The second I killed the engine, the world went terrifyingly quiet. I opened the door, and the October air hit me like a wet shroud. It was colder than before, a sharp, biting chill that smelled of damp earth and diesel. And with the cold came that sensation, the weight on the back of my neck. It felt like a physical touch, a heavy, greasy gaze locked onto the space between my shoulder blades. I grabbed my work bag and stepped out, hitting the lock button on my key fob 3 times. Beep, beep, beep. The sound felt like a gunshot in the stillness. I started walking toward room 114. I focused on the cracks in the concrete. I focused on the rhythm of my own boots. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Halfway there, my peripheral vision betrayed me. I glanced sideways at the truck. The windows were opaque, a wall of black glass, but I knew he was in there. I could almost feel the heat of his breath against the window. I could almost see the predatory stillness of his posture. I didn't speed up. I knew that if I ran, the hunt would begin. I kept my pace steady, reached my door and fumbled the key into the lock. My hands were slick with cold sweat. I slipped inside, slammed the door and threw the deadbolt, then the handle lock, then the security chain. I stood there in the dark, my forehead pressed against the cool wood of the door, listening to the blood roar in my ears. Part 15. The betrayal at the desk. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want him to see my shadow. I didn't want him to know exactly where I was standing. I crept to the window, moving with the agonizing slowness of a thief. I peeled back the edge of the curtain by a fraction of an inch. The truck was still there. It hadn't moved an inch. It was positioned perfectly to see the door and the window of room 114. My hands started shaking. It started in my fingertips and traveled up my arms until my whole body was vibrating. This wasn't a creepy local anymore. This was a siege. I grabbed my phone and dialed the office. I didn't care if I sounded crazy. I didn't care if I woke the whole building. The owner picked up on the first ring, not a hello, just a heavy, expectant silence. The truck, I whispered, my voice cracking. He's back. He's sitting right outside my door again. You need to call the police or tell him to leave. I heard a long, weary sigh on the other end of the line. It wasn't the sigh of someone who was scared. It was the sigh of someone who was being inconvenienced. What do you want me to do about it, Mr. Saar? He said. His voice was flat, devoid of any empathy. Tell me who it is. I snapped, the panic finally turning into a jagged edge of anger. Why is he following me? Why is he watching my room? There was another pause. I could hear the faint sound of a television in the background of the office. Some old game show, the applause sounding like static. Look, the owner said, his voice dropping into a low, warning tone. As long as he's not breaking anything, there's nothing I can do. This is a public parking lot. People sit in their cars all the time. That's not an answer. You saw what he did last night. You saw the door. That's the only answer you're getting, he replied. Then the line went dead. The dial tone was the loneliest sound I've ever heard. It confirmed the one thing I had been trying to deny. I was alone. The woman at the desk, the owner, the town, they weren't bystanders. They were the environment. This motel wasn't a business, it was a blind. A place where things were allowed to happen because no one was looking, and the people in charge were paid to keep it that way. Part 16. The sound on the glass. I backed away from the phone, my heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm. I knew I had to leave. Now I didn't care about the darkness or the roads. I'd rather die in a car chase than wait in this box for whatever was coming next. I started grabbing my gear. I didn't fold, I didn't pack. I just shoveled my clothes into the bag, my tools clanking together in a messy pile. I was reaching for my phone charger when the sound stopped me dead. Tap. It was light, delicate, the sound of a single fingernail hitting the glass of the window. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, cold lump. Tap, tap. It was slow, deliberate, rhythmic. It wasn't a knock for attention. It was a test of my reaction. I stood in the center of the room, staring at the floral pattern of the curtains. The orange light from the parking lot filtered through, showing the silhouette of something on the other side. Not a whole person, just a shadow. Scree, the sound changed. It wasn't a tap anymore. It was a long, slow drag. Like someone was running a sharp, jagged nail down the length of the pane, back and forth. It was the sound of something feeling the texture of the glass, searching for a weakness, or maybe just enjoying the sound of my terror. My throat went dry. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. He was right there. He was inches away, separated only by a sheet of glass and a piece of cheap fabric. Part 17, the room next door. I reached for my phone again. I didn't call the office. I dialed 911, my fingers fumbling so badly I nearly dropped the device. "There's someone outside my window," I whispered to the operator. "Pinecrest Motel, room 114, please. He's right there." The operator started asking for my name, my location, the description of the suspect. But I stopped listening, because the sound changed again. It didn't come from the window this time. Click. It was the sound of a key sliding into a lock, not my lock. The sound came from the wall to my left, room 112. The room that the owner had told me was empty, the room that should have been silent. I heard the heavy thud of a door opening, followed by the soft snick of a deadbolt being thrown from the inside. Then movement. It wasn't the sound of someone checking in. There was no luggage hitting the floor, no light switch clicking. Instead, I heard the sound of furniture being moved, slow, careful drags across the carpet. I stepped toward the shared wall, my ear inches from the peeling wallpaper. I could hear breathing, not one person, two, maybe three. They were communicating in low, guttural whispers that didn't sound like words. Thud. A single, massive blow hit the wall right where my head was. It was so hard the drywall cracked. It was a test. They were checking the thickness of the wall. They were checking to see how far I'd jump. My heart felt like it stopped beating entirely. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The guy in the truck wasn't the only one. He was the distraction. He was the one meant to keep my eyes on the window, on the door, on the parking lot. While I was staring at the curtain, terrified of the man outside, the real threat was already inside the building. They were in the room next door. They were in the walls, and they had been waiting for me to lock myself in. I looked at the front door. The man was still tapping on the window. I looked at the shared wall. The shadows were moving. There wasn't just one watcher, there was a team. And I had just spent the last 10 minutes making sure I was trapped in a room with only one way out, and they held the keys to both sides of it. Part 18. The bathroom breach. The single thud against the wall wasn't random. It wasn't the building settling, and it wasn't a clumsy guest. It was a measurement. I stepped back slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped animal. Every instinct I had, thousands of years of evolutionary survival, was screaming at me to get away from that wall. In my mind, I could see them on the other side, marking the studs, feeling for the hollow points, preparing to come through the plaster like a nightmare. The 911 operator's voice was a tinny, distant buzz in my ear. She was professional, calm, asking me to confirm how many people I thought were out there. But the air had been sucked out of the room. I couldn't answer. I couldn't even draw enough breath to whisper, because now the silence was worse than the noise. I could hear them. Right on the other side of the wallpaper, slow, careful footsteps, the muffled, rhythmic sliding of socks on cheap carpet. They were moving in sync with me. When I stepped back, they stepped forward. It was a predatory dance, and I was the one being led. Then the sound moved. It drifted from the bedroom wall toward the bathroom. I turned my head so fast the vertebrae in my neck popped. The bathroom door was cracked open just an inch, revealing the frosted glass of the tiny ventilation window above the toilet. Creak. The window moved. It didn't just rattle in the wind, it tilted inward. Someone was on a ladder or standing on the back of a truck, pushing against the frame with a steady, rhythmic pressure. "No, no, no," I hissed. I bolted into the bathroom, my boots skidding on the linoleum. I grabbed the window frame with both hands and shoved it shut with everything I had. For a heartbeat, there was a terrifying resistance. Something, a hand, a shoulder pushed back. It wasn't a violent shove, it was firm. It was the strength of someone who wasn't afraid of being caught. I screamed a wordless sound of pure rage and terror, slamming the window into the casing and forcing the cheap plastic latch down. It felt like a toy in my hands. It wouldn't stop a child, let alone whatever was out there. I backed out of the bathroom, my eyes locked on that frosted glass, waiting for a rock to shatter it or a crowbar to pry it open. But nothing happened. The pushing stopped, And that was the moment I realized they weren't trying to get in yet. They were just letting me know they could. They wanted me awake, they wanted me cornered. Part 19, the polite knock. Sir, officers are 2 minutes out. Stay on the line, the operator urged. 2 minutes. In a normal world, 2 minutes is the time it takes to toast bread. In room 114, 2 minutes felt like a lifetime in solitary confinement. I scrambled back into the main room, my eyes darting for anything at all, that could serve as a weapon. My gaze landed on the heavy, brass-based lamp on the nightstand. I ripped the cord from the wall, the sparks showering the carpet, and gripped the neck of the lamp like a club. It was pathetic, but the weight of it in my hand gave me a sliver of something that felt like hope. Then it came from the front door. Knock, knock. It was soft, it was polite. It was the exact same cadence as the night before. My stomach twisted into a cold knot. It was the psychological cruelty of it that broke me. They were repeating the pattern. They were treating this like a ritual. I backed into the far corner of the room near the TV where I could see both the door and the bathroom entrance. Knock, 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 firmer this time, more insistent. I jammed the chair harder under the handle, the wood groaning under the pressure. I didn't make a sound. I didn't even breathe. I was a ghost in my own skin. Then the wall behind the bed shook again. Boom, it wasn't a thud this time, it was a strike. A sledgehammer or a heavy boot slammed into the center of the wall, sending a cloud of white drywall dust puffing out from behind the headboard. I flinched, nearly dropping the lamp, and then came the whispering. It was a low, distorted murmur coming from the other side of the wall. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a conversation. One voice from the room next door was communicating with the person at my front door. They were coordinating. They were timing me. There were at least 2, maybe 3. Maybe the whole motel was in on it. The doorknob began to rattle slowly, methodically, left then right, testing the play in the latch, testing the strength of the chair. Then abruptly everything stopped. The knocking, the whispering, the rattling. The world fell into a silence so absolute it felt deafening. It was the silence of a forest right before a lightning strike. They were waiting. They were listening for the sirens. Part 20, the blue and red salvation, then light. Bright, blinding white light cut through the gaps in the curtains like a physical blade. It swept across the room, illuminating the dust motes and my own terrified reflection in the mirror. Instantly, the silence was shattered by chaos. I heard the sound of heavy boots hitting the pavement, running. Multiple sets of footsteps. They weren't running toward me, they were scattering. I heard the thud of someone jumping from a height near the bathroom window. I heard a door slam in the unit next to mine. I heard a vehicle, not the truck, but something smaller, peel out from the far side of the lot. They moved with the precision of a military unit. They knew exactly where the blind spots were. They knew exactly when the police would turn the corner. A loud, heavy rap hit the door. Police, open up. I didn't hesitate. I threw the chair aside, flipped the deadbolt and yanked the door open. 2 officers stood there, their flashlights blinding me, their shadows stretching long across the parking lot. I didn't say a word. I just stood there shaking, the metal lamp still clutched in my hand like a holy relic. Are you all right? The younger officer asked, his hand resting on his holster. I nodded, but my throat was a desert. I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the wall and the bathroom. Part 21, the empty evidence. They moved through the room with practiced efficiency. One stayed with me while the other checked the perimeter. The report was a nightmare. The screen to the bathroom window wasn't just loosened, it had been surgically removed, the tabs cut with a sharp blade and tossed into the tall grass. It hadn't fallen, it had been taken. The officer crouched by the window frame, his flashlight reflecting off the metal. Fresh marks, he muttered. Someone was definitely trying to pry this open. Then they moved to room 112, the room next to mine. The door was ajar, not kicked in, not forced, unlocked. Inside the room was a skeleton. No luggage, no bedsheets, just the bare mattress and the smell of stale cigarettes. But on the floor, in the thick layer of dust that had settled over months of neglect, were footprints, multiple sets, leading from the door to the shared wall. They had been standing there inches from me for hours. The older officer, the one I'd seen that morning, came back into my room. He looked at the cracked drywall behind my bed. He looked at my packed bag. His face was grim, a map of lines that suggested he'd seen this movie before and hated the ending. You said you saw a green pickup, he asked. Yes, I said, my voice finally returning, though it sounded like it belonged to someone else. Same one as this morning, same one as last night. He nodded slowly. He exchanged a look with his partner, a look of silent, heavy recognition. He stepped closer to me, his voice dropping so low the body cam probably wouldn't pick it up. "You need to leave," he said. "Right now, don't wait for the sun, don't check out. Just get in your truck and drive." "I was already going to," I replied, my hands still trembling. "But why? What is this? Is it a cult? A gang?" He hesitated, glancing toward the motel office where the vacancy sign was still buzzing its sickly red light. "Because this isn't the first time we've been called to room 114, he whispered. "But it's the first time in a long time that the person inside was still there to open the door." Part 22. Conclusion. I didn't ask for a second explanation. I threw my bag into my truck, the officers standing guard until my engine roared to life. I didn't look at the office. I didn't look at the woods. I drove until I hit the state line, and then I drove some more. I found out later that the Pinecrest Motel burned down 6 months after my stay. Electrical fire, the papers said, but I don't believe in accidents anymore, not in that town. I still have the Polaroid the man slid under my door. I keep it in a drawer, locked away. Sometimes I look at it just to remind myself that I wasn't crazy, that I really was lying in that bed while someone stood over me taking a souvenir, because the scariest thing isn't the knock on the door. It isn't the face in the window. The scariest thing is knowing that there are places in this world where you aren't a guest, you're just a resource, and the quiet you notice when you're alone, that's not silence, that's them holding their breath. Stay safe, stay in the light. And if you ever find yourself in a town that feels like a funeral, keep driving. Part 23. The anatomy of a pattern. The moment the officer said those words, the air seemed to turn to lead in my lungs. This isn't the first time. It wasn't a warning. It was a cold, hard confirmation of a reality I had been trying to negotiate away all night. My mind, desperate for safety, had tried to categorize this as a random act of a lone madman. But patterns don't belong to madmen. Patterns belong to hunters. Patterns imply a system, a history, and a success rate. How many times? I asked. My voice sounded small, muffled by the oppressive dampness of the night. The officer didn't answer immediately. He exchanged a look with his partner, a weary, heavy glance that spoke of paperwork, unsolved disappearances, and the kind of secrets that keep a small-town police force quiet. "Enough," he finally said. "Enough that we recognize the rhythm of it. We call it the filter. This motel. It sits at a specific crossroads between 3 state lines. It's the perfect place for people who aren't looking for a Hilton. It's the perfect place for people who are essentially invisible." "Invisible," I repeated. "Men traveling alone," he continued, his flashlight beam wandering over the cracked asphalt. "Contractors like you, long-haul truckers, guys with out-of-state plates and no local ties. You stay a night, maybe 2, you're tired, you're on a schedule, and most importantly, nobody expects you home for a week. That's the window they look for." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind. They weren't just looking for victims, they were looking for data. They were looking for people whose absence wouldn't trigger an immediate alarm. Part 24. The violation of the truck. I didn't wait for a third warning. I moved like a man possessed, shoving the last of my tools into my heavy canvas bag. The officers stood like sentinels outside my door, their silhouettes flickering in the strobe-like pulse of the motel's dying neon sign. Every time I looked at the window, I expected to see the glass shatter. I expected to see that tan jacket and the shadow-filled cap, but the lot was empty. The green pickup had vanished into the mist as if it had been a hallucination, but I knew better now. It hadn't left, it had just repositioned. Before I climbed into the cab, the older officer caught my arm. His grip was like iron. "Check your vehicle," he said, "all of it." I walked around my truck, my own flashlight trembling in my hand. At first it looked fine. But then, as the light hit the driver's side door at a sharp angle, I saw them. Fresh, jagged silver scratches right around the keyhole. Someone had been working on this lock while I was inside staring at the curtain. They hadn't just been watching me, they had been trying to ensure that when I finally ran, I wouldn't be able to get inside my own sanctuary. "Check inside too," the officer urged. I unlocked the door, the mechanism clicking with a heavy, ominous sound. The interior smelled like my own coffee and old upholstery. Everything seemed normal, but as I reached for the ignition, I noticed the glove box. It was hanging open by a fraction of an inch. I'm a perfectionist with my gear. I never leave it unlatched. I flipped it open. My registration was there, my insurance was there, but resting on top of them was a jagged scrap of newsprint. I picked it up. My fingers felt like blocks of ice. On the back of the paper, written in a cramped, hurried hand, was my license plate number. Underneath it was room 114, and underneath that, written in a darker, bolder ink, was a string of 10 digits, my cell phone number. I felt the blood drain from my face. They hadn't just looked at my truck, they had gone through my paperwork. They knew my name. They knew where I lived. They had been in my life before I even knew they existed. "They've been watching you since the state line, son," the officer said softly. "You didn't stumble into this, you were brought into it." Part 25, the ghost on the line. I drove. I didn't just drive, I fled. I pushed that truck until the engine screamed, leaving the Pine Crest and that hollow town in a cloud of exhaust and gravel. I didn't look at the rearview mirror for the first 10 miles because I was too afraid of what I'd see. When I finally did, the road behind me was a black ribbon of nothingness. 30 minutes into the drive, I was deep into the rural farmland, where the only lights were the occasional distant glow of a farmhouse. My adrenaline was starting to dip, replaced by a crushing, hollow exhaustion. Then my phone buzzed in the cup holder. Unknown caller. My heart did a violent somersault. I told myself it was the police calling to follow up. I told myself it was my company checking on the job. I swiped the screen. "Hello," I said. My voice was a ragged whisper. Silence, not the silence of a dropped call. It was a live silence. I could hear the faint, rhythmic hiss of static, and then the breathing began. It was slow, deep. It sounded like it was coming from someone who had just finished a long walk. It was wet and heavy, the sound of a throat constricted by a smile. "Who is this?" I shouted. "I've already called the cops. They have your plate. They know who you are." No answer, just that steady, mocking respiration. And then, right before the line went dead, I heard a sound that made me nearly veer off the road. "London Bridge is falling down." The same whistle from the motel door. He wasn't on a different phone. He was using the information he took from my glove box to let me know that distance didn't matter. The road didn't matter. I pulled over onto the shoulder, my chest heaving. I checked the back seat. I checked under the chassis with my maglite. I was a man losing his mind in the middle of a cornfield. I looked at the phone, no number, no location, just the word unknown staring back at me like an eyeless face. Part 26, the driveway sentinel. I didn't stop again. I drove 5 hours straight, bypassing my usual gas stations, ignoring the low fuel light until I was in my own zip code. By the time I turned onto my street, the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, turning the sky a pale, sickly grey. I saw my house, a small brick bungalow with a neat lawn. It was the place I had worked 10 years to buy. It was supposed to be the one place where the pattern couldn't reach me. I pulled into the driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires. I killed the engine and just sat there, my hands still fused to the steering wheel. I felt a wave of relief so intense I almost cried. I was home, I had the deadbolt, I had my dog, I had my life. I grabbed my bag, stepped out of the truck and hit the lock button. The chirp of the alarm felt like a victory cry, but as I reached for my house keys, that feeling returned. It wasn't a sudden shock, it was a slow, oily realization. The air in my neighborhood was too quiet. The birds weren't singing, the wind had died down, and that weight, that greasy, heavy pressure on the back of my neck slammed back into place. I stood frozen on my front porch, my key inches from the lock. I didn't want to turn around. I knew that if I stayed facing the door, I could pretend the world was still normal. Slowly, against every ounce of my will, I turned my head. Down the street, parked perfectly in the shadow of a large oak tree, sat a dark green pickup truck. The engine was running. I could see the faint, rhythmic puff of white exhaust in the morning air. The headlights were off. The interior was a black pit. He hadn't followed me. Following implies a chase. He had beaten me here. He knew the destination because he had read the registration in room 114. He had driven through the night, bypassing the slow roads, waiting for the moment I felt safest to show me that there is no such thing as a way. The driver's side door of the green truck began to creak open. Part 27, the reality of the we. For a second, I couldn't move. My brain simply refused to process the visual information my eyes were sending it. That truck wasn't supposed to be there, not here, not in my sanctuary. I had driven almost 2 hours. I had taken 3 different interstate exits and looped back through 2 residential side streets just to be sure. I had checked my mirrors until my eyes burned. There was no logical way that truck could have followed me without me noticing, and yet there it was. Parked under the oak tree like a predator in the high grass, engine idling with that same low guttural vibration, lights off, a black hole in the middle of a suburban morning. My grip tightened around my work bag, the heavy metal tools inside clinking together, a pathetic sound compared to the dread in my gut. Every instinct screamed, "Get inside, don't look back," but I was paralyzed. I felt like if I broke eye contact with that windshield, the truck would lung forward. Then the driver's side door creaked open. It was a slow, agonizing sound, not rushed, not aggressive, just controlled. The man stepped out. He was tall, wearing that same dark canvas jacket and the baseball cap pulled low. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt them. They were like twin weights pressing against my chest. He didn't walk toward me immediately. He just stood by his door, one hand on the roof of the truck, watching me struggle with the simple reality of his presence. Then he took one single, deliberate step forward. That was the trigger. I snapped. I turned and sprinted for my porch, my keys jingling in a frantic metallic rhythm. I could hear his footsteps behind me. They weren't fast. He wasn't sprinting, he was just walking. Thump, pause, thump. He knew I was cornered. He knew I had nowhere left to run. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped the keys between the porch slats. I jammed the key in, twisted, and threw myself inside. I slammed the door through the deadbolt, hooked the chain, and leaned my full weight against the wood, gasping for air that felt like fire. I waited for the heavy blow against the door. I waited for the wood to splinter. Nothing. I crept to the side window and twitched the curtain. The street was empty. The oak tree stood alone. The truck was gone. No sound of a retreating engine, no screech of tires, just a void. Part 28, the voice on the line. I didn't sleep. I sat on my sofa with every light in the house blazing, clutching a kitchen knife in one hand and my phone in the other. I watched the shadows shift as the sun rose, convinced that every creak of the floorboards was a footstep. But when morning finally came, the world looked disgustingly normal. My neighbors were out walking dogs. The mailman drove by. No green truck. I started to tell myself I was losing it. Maybe the stress of the motel had followed me home in the form of a hallucination. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered. Hello. Silence. Then a voice. It was low, calm, and utterly devoid of emotion. It sounded like a recording, but the timing was too perfect. You left. My blood turned to slush. You weren't supposed to leave, the voice continued. Each syllable was measured like a judge reading a sentence. Who is this? I managed to choke out. What do you want? A long pause. I could hear a faint sound in the background, the sound of a flickering fluorescent light. We were close. Click. The word echoed in my skull. We, not I. It wasn't just the man in the truck. It was the woman at the desk. It was the owner. It was whoever was in room 112. It was a we that had no face and no end. Part 29, the final tap. I called the police again. I gave them the newspaper scrap. I gave them the phone logs. They were sympathetic, but their hands were tied. There were no cameras on my street. The unknown number was routed through an untraceable VoIP server. The newspaper was a generic clipping from a town 3 states away. We'll keep a patrol car in the area, they said, but I knew what that meant. It meant they'd drive by once an hour until something actually happened. 3 nights passed, 3 nights of jumping at every shadow. By the 4th night I was exhausted. My eyes were bloodshot, my mind drifting into that hazy, disconnected state of sleep deprivation. I was lying in bed, the blue light of my phone the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. The house was silent, a tomb-like quiet, then tap. I stopped scrolling, my thumb froze on the screen. Tap, tap. It came from the window right next to my head, the window on the 2nd floor. It was the same sound, the fingernail on glass, the slow, deliberate drag of something sharp against the pane, screechy. I didn't turn around, I couldn't, because I realized something that made my heart stop. I had locked my front door, I had locked the back door, but I hadn't checked the guest room window. And as I lay there, too terrified to breathe, I heard a new sound. Not from the window, from inside my hallway. Thump, pause, thump, the slow, measured footsteps of someone who isn't in a hurry because they know you have nowhere else to go. Part 30, conclusion, the outro. I'm recording this from the closet. I have the police on the other line, but they're 10 minutes away. I can hear the floorboards groaning in the living room. If you're watching this, if you ever find yourself in a place that feels wrong, don't wait for a sign, don't wait for a pattern, just leave. Because once they pick you, once you become part of the we, they don't stop, they don't move on, they just wait for you to think you're safe, stay in the light, keep your doors locked, and if you hear a tap on your window tonight, don't look. Part 31, the rhythmic terror tappy tap. My entire body went still, not a single muscle moved. I was a statue of salt, frozen in the middle of my own bed, because I knew that rhythm. I had heard it in that godforsaken motel in the middle of nowhere. I had heard it against the glass of room 114. It was a signature, a calling card. It was the sound of something marking its territory. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't even think to call 911 right away. My brain was stuck in a loop of denial. I just listened, hoping, praying. I tried to tell myself it was a branch from the oak tree outside hitting the siding. I tried to tell myself it was the wind catching the screen. Anything. Any mundane, earthly explanation that didn't involve a man in a dark jacket standing on my flower beds. Tap, closer now. It wasn't the wind. The wind is chaotic. The wind doesn't wait for you to catch your breath before it strikes again. This was deliberate. This was controlled. This was someone savoring the sound of my heart hammering against my ribs. My chest tightened as I slowly, agonizingly, turned my head toward the window beside my bed. The curtains were heavy, but they were shifting. Just a slight, unnatural flutter at the bottom edge. Like something on the other side was breathing against the glass, the heat of their lungs creating a microscopic fog that I couldn't see but I could feel. Tap, tap, then it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. It was a pressurized silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. I waited. Minutes felt like hours. I stayed pinned to the mattress, staring at the floral pattern of the curtain until the shapes began to swim in the dark. Part 32, the voice in the receiver. Finally, my hand moved. It felt like someone else's hand, heavy, clumsy, trembling. I grabbed my phone and dialed those 3 digits again. The operator answered on the first ring. I kept my voice so low it was barely a vibration in my throat. "There's someone outside my house," I whispered. "Please, I hear them at my bedroom window." "Stay where you are, sir," she said. Her voice was a lifeline, but it felt thin. "Officers are being dispatched. Are all your doors locked?" "Yes," I breathed. "Deadbolts, chains, everything." "Are you alone in the house?" I hesitated. My house felt vast and empty, a shell of drywall and wood. "Yes, I'm alone." Then a sound came through the phone. It wasn't the operator. It wasn't the static of the line. It was a second voice, a faint, wet intake of air, a breath. My blood ran cold instantly. It wasn't coming from my room. It was coming from the phone line. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my eyes widening in the dark. "Sir, stay on the line," she began, but her voice was drowned out by a new sound outside my window. Scrape. Something sharp, a blade, or perhaps just a jagged fingernail dragged across the glass. It was a long, slow sound that set my teeth on edge. Scree. They weren't trying to break the glass. They were testing the surface. They were feeling the thickness of the barrier between us. Part 33. The face in the glass. I couldn't stay under the blanket anymore. The darkness under the covers felt like a shroud. I needed to see. I needed to know what was standing 3 inches from my face. Slowly, carefully, I pulled the fabric down, and for a second I saw it. A face. It wasn't clear. It was a smudge of grey against the blackness of the night. A shadow pressed so tightly against the glass that the features were distorted. One eye, wide and unblinking, stared through the gap in the curtains. Watching, I froze. I stopped being a person and became an object. The figure didn't move, it didn't knock, it didn't speak. It just stayed there, tilted at an angle, looking in, waiting for me to realize the truth. Then slowly it tilted its head to the left, and that's when the true horror set in. Behind that face, further back in the darkness of my yard, was another shadow. There wasn't just one. There were 2, one standing right at the glass and another standing 10 feet back, watching the first one. It wasn't a person. It was a system, a network, an organized effort. I wasn't being stalked by a crazy person. I was being harvested by a group. The operator was still talking through the phone, her voice a distant, meaningless chatter. I couldn't respond. I couldn't speak, because now I understood the "we" from the phone call. They weren't random. They hadn't just found me at the motel. They had been choosing, tracking, following. The motel wasn't the trap. The road was the trap. And my house was just the final destination. Part 34, the unlocking. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. I didn't hang up. I just set it on the nightstand, the operator's voice sounding like an insect buzzing in the dark. Then I heard it, click. It wasn't from the window, it was from the front door. The sound of a key, my key turning in the lock. Slow, careful, methodical. Someone was unlocking my front door. The deadbolt that I had checked 3 times, the chain that I had slid into place. It didn't matter, they had my keys. They had probably copied them while I was sleeping in room 114, or perhaps they had them long before that. I stared at my bedroom door, my heart racing so fast I felt a stabbing pain in my chest. I watched the doorknob. It began to turn just a fraction, a test of the latch. I grabbed the only thing I could reach, the heavy metal lamp. The same one I'd used to defend myself at the motel. It felt like a toothpick against an avalanche. The knob turned again, more this time. The door groaned as the wood shifted. Then a voice, soft, right outside the bedroom door. You ran. I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt like they had turned to stone. You weren't supposed to run, Krish. The voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It was the voice of someone who had already won. It was calm, certain. I backed up slowly until my spine hit the cold plaster of the wall. Lamp raised, hands shaking so hard the metal base rattled against the wall. The doorknob twisted again. This time the lock gave. The door started to swing open, the light from the hallway, light I hadn't turned on, spilling into the room in a long, terrifying rectangle. And in that moment, as the shadow of a man stepped across the threshold, I realized the final, crushing truth. There was no escape this time. Because there was nowhere left to go, I had brought them to the only place I called home. I wasn't the first person to stay in room 114, and after tonight I wouldn't be the last. The pattern was complete. Outro if you're still listening. If you're still in your room looking at your own door, make sure you know who has your keys. Make sure you know who's watching your truck, because some people don't want your money, they don't want your car. They just want to see how far you'll run before you realize you're already caught. If you are new here, subscribe to Tales of the Dark, where every story gives you a nightmare. Stay in the light, because the we are always waiting in the shadows. Good night.